Well, thank you so much, Stefan and Janine, for the beautiful invitation. I'm really very, very glad to be here, very honored to have the opportunity to share with you a little bit about my research projects. And actually, I'm going to talk about, about some essentials of this project, especially in the part of my research that touches the philosophical history, perhaps the ideological, philosophical history of black slavery connected to colonial scholasticism. My current research project has as a central concern philosophical along with legal and theological assessments of a particular form of slavery, black slavery, regrettably practiced in the Western world and in particular in Latin America in a period that stretches from the 16th up to the 19th century. The focus of the study is the investigation of authors and works that represent views of early modern and modern scholasticism, broadly speaking, including here the influence of their approaches in Latin American scholastic thinkers. There is still a notorious lack of philosophical studies dealing with such authors and works, examining the main lines of their normative considerations on black slavery. It is important to say at the beginning that the classical view on slavery that is most impactful on the history of philosophy, at least until the middle of the 16th century, is the one advanced by Aristotle. Although one should recognize that already Plato accepted slavery, even affirming that a true slave is a person who has a lack of reason, and included slaves in his account of constitutional ideal states, it was Aristotle who offered the first detailed grounding of such a condition and pre-political institution. He proposed a theory of natural slavery. In Book 1 of his Politics, Aristotle defends slavery as a social institution. It was not only a political and legal creation, but primarily an institution based on nature itself. There are natural slaves, and so slavery is or can be natural. A human being is a slave by nature because of his lack of reason. Aristotle affirms that a slave by nature is one who has no deliberative faculty at all, and the best he can be in order to fulfill his nature is to become under a relationship of subjection, no more than a living but separated part of the master's bodily frame. As an institution that sets up a particular form of social relationship, slavery thus brings benefits both to the master, who profits from the instrumental labor of the natural slave and can then dedicate himself to political activity and virtue, fulfilling his natural telos, and to the slave himself, who can then be affected by the deliberative ability of the slaveholder. The slaveholder, as the only one in the complementary relationship who has full human logos, disciplines the slave according to the level of deficiency in reason of the latter. Aristotelian slavery is a form of bios for the living beings that do not realize their nature according to the completeness of their specific form, which is the human life. Such a life will never possibly turn, strictly speaking, into a bios politikos. Curiously enough, any other form of legal political slavery institution and systems based on customary and positive law, as we find in 16th, 17th century, was viewed by Aristotle as unnatural and morally wrong. Truly, the universe of sources of philosophical and theological views on slavery, known and more or less shared by second scholastic authors, also embraces the accounts given by fathers of the Church, particularly by Augustine, who combine an explanation of differences among human beings with the biblical idea of sin as a cause of slavery. And we should mention that a thinker as devoted to natural law law theory as Thomas Aquinas, who seems to recognize, in line with the Stoic jus naturale, the natural law, original freedom for all human beings, also accepted slavery according to the law of peoples. After the issuing in 1537 of the Bull Sublimis Deus by Pope Paul III and the critical reception of Aristotle's Politics by masters of Francisco de Vitoria's generation, the great professor in Salamanca and beyond, and more specifically, after the debates between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda on the juridical claim of just wars of conquest against the barbarians and infidels of the New World, theories of natural slavery modeled after Aristotle were, strictly speaking, rejected by Catholic intellectuals, as well as by Baroque and early modern, also secular thinkers in general, or at least defended in much more diffuse and attenuated ways, that is, as a matter of current and not permanent state of people. A strict abolitionist conviction in Western thought, condemning both natural and civil forms of slavery as morally wrong, was reached first in the 19th century. It is worth mentioning that the Catholic Church published only in 1839 an official document, the Apostolic Letter in Supremo Apostolatus by Pope Gregory XVI, condemning slavery as a social institution and particularly every form of slave trade, where the focus of condemnation was black slavery indeed. In fact, in the last two remarks, regard above all black slavery, which in the broad space of transatlantic relationships between Africa and the Americas became an institution in the 16th century. Closely connected to traditional accounts of reasons for civil enslavement of human beings, we face now, with the slavery of blacks, the basic new kind of slavery in the sense of the combination of the following several characteristics: as the status of being someone else's property and a merchandised or a market good, and thus, and particularly, the property both of traders and holders for purposes of massive economic production on national and international, also transoceanic scales. There is, however, at this point, a striking mental situation concerning slavery that cannot be easily grasped. In a sense, the same generations of thinkers who rejected the natural slavery of Indians and attempted to liberate indigenous peoples also from civil forms of servitude indulged slave trade and black slavery. How was that possible? What are the characteristics of their theoretical accounts and the features of their practical concerns or applied ethics? Among the first authors that reflected on black slavery, we find, for example, Domingo de Soto, Tomás de Mercado, and the jurist active in Mexico, Bartolomé de Frias y Albornoz. I want to research and to make my research about all these guys and what they wrote. But there is a consensus that the Jesuit Luis de Molina was the first intellectual to extensively consider the topic of black slavery, and after him many others such as Fernando Rebelo and Tomás Sánchez, as well as the Jesuit father Alonso de Sandoval, whose ministry had place in Cartagena de Indias, today's Colombia, and Diego de Avendaño, who was a leading theologian and juridical advisor in Lima, the viceroyalty of Peru. In order to explore the normative treatment scholastic thinkers made of black slavery, usually placing the problem of slavery within the broad discussion of moral conscience and more narrowly within the questions on the nature and justice of trade and contracts, I structured my presentation according to a few stations that might also be guiding marks for future studies. Let's begin with Luis de Molina, the basic structure of evaluating enslavement titles. Luis de Molina influential assessment of black slavery can be found in his De Justitia et Jure. I just gave you the copy of the frontispiece of one of the editions, in 9 disputations. The literature Gender on Justice and Right was an invention of masters of the University of Salamanca, which resulted from the attempt of interpreting together Thomas Aquinas' treatments on law, right, and justice, that is, central topics of moral philosophy that Aquinas had treated in 2 distinct parts of his Summa Theologiae. In that part of his De Justitia et Jure, Molina was thus dealing with commutative justice, the justice that regulates over exchanges concerning external goods. We should have in mind that this is a treatise by a university professor. The Spanish Jesuit Luis de Molina was, in the last decade of the 16th century, professor of theology and philosophy at the Portuguese University of Évora, and thus very much aware of the role played by the Portuguese crown in the strategies of colonization through enslaved labor force from Africa. Moreover, we should say from the beginning that his approach was exclusively normative. Although he shares the view that there are non-Christian barbarian societies in sub-Saharan Africa, there are no racial or ethnic points of view in his arguments. According to Matthias Kaufmann, the whole treatise presupposes a definition of right, which makes reference to the later idea of subjective right. Right, or jus, is a faculty to do something, to receive something, to maintain something, or to act in any way so that whomever hinders the one who has it, without legitimate reasons, is doing him a legal wrong, an injustice. In this sense, Molina's exposition of the slavery problem focused on a moral legal analysis of enslavement and slave trade, including approaches to the subjective rights of masters and of slaves. The detailed exposition is placed under a theory of dominium proprietatis, a theory about the right of property, that is, a theory about the right of possessing things. Slavery is, of course, a kind of property right, implying an extreme form of dependence and submission, as well as a certain loss of freedom. But what is freedom? Molina sees in the freedom at stake the idea of an internal good, and it means, of course, not the internal freedom of decision, but rather a kind of liberty or freedom in or for the external world. It essentially means the possession of one's own body and the use of the body, usually presupposing that such a possession is claimed and valid within the context of a given human society and political organization. Honor and fame or reputation are internal goods too, and all of them are contrasted to external goods or things which are not oneself or in oneself. In principle, a human being can exert dominion both over internal and external things, and the internal goods just mentioned belong to him according to natural law. Molina affirms that a human being is lord of his freedom. Regarding the way how a human being can be legally deprived of dominion over himself in terms of the possession of his body for the sake of free use of it, becoming someone else's property, Molina initially proposed a quite traditional set of conditions. Enslavement might be the result of corrective justice because of a just war, where death penalty is converted into social death or perpetual enslavement, a form of alternative punishment for a momentous crime that would otherwise be most severely punished, a condition that would result from a father selling in a situation of most grave need, either himself or a member of his family, say his children, where for a just price in that selling and purchasing relationship, someone's freedom is sold and his slavery is bought. A condition caused by simply being born from an enslaved person, or more exactly, from an enslaved woman, since birth follows the condition of the womb. The first condition, which, despite different accents, is in line with Francisco de Vitoria's account of just war, presupposes as just causes the offending accorded principles of the law of peoples. It might be a measure of justice by the offended side, at least when the offending side is not a Christian nation, in order to restore just peace after a just war, that people captured have their death penalty converted into perpetual servitude. It has been noticed that Molina offers an etymological explanation for the word servus in Latin, from servando, namely by reminding us of the tradition that emperors, as high as military commanders, martial judges, might save someone's life by commuting death for bondage. Also, the Latin word for bondage, that is mancipium, derives from manukapta, that is hands caught, meaning that a life form in bondage is better than death. Regarding the third title, Molina essentially describes among and beyond several conditions predicted in Roman law regarding the person to be sold and the terms of the purchase, how we should understand the most grave need as an imminent risk of death because of poverty, want, or equivalent situations. It has been argued that Molina's emphasis on a human being's own possession of his freedom had the effect of being more concessive regarding self-enslavement due to most grave, though not extreme necessity, a topic many Jesuit authors discussed, for self-enslavement by adults might appear to contradict natural law. The emphasis in Molina's explanations lies on the fact that an enslaved person becomes someone's property through purchase within a trade system. For him, the relational notion of being a property needs further determination, as long as the nature of the possessed thing is concerned. Being the owner of a human being through purchase does imply possessing his liberty, but it does not imply possessing his life. It allows the possession of someone's body for a conditional use, never for an absolute use. That is, for forcefully working for his owner, as well as the possession of the fruits of their work, other incomes obtainable from them, and children born by enslaved women. There can be no absolute possession of a human being, therefore no absolute servitude, as in an analogous way, there is no absolute liberty, but only conditional liberty. A slaveholder has no ownership over the physical health of someone's body or over his spiritual wellness, what implies that the holder is not allowed to dispose as he wishes of a slave's limbs, and any further item the very life of the slave depends upon. Even if the grounds for legitimate enslavement are very much connected to the kind of private property slave that was taken into account in the Roman law, whose legal status was hugely reduced, Molina relies here on philosophical medieval sources to be found both in Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus to defend the principle according to which the status of slavery is always conditional. It is conditioned by the scope of acts and uses of the body that, in spite of enslavement, remain under the slave's control and thus are his remaining scope of freedom. We can say that extension of acts or uses that remain in a slave's possession amounts to his rights. The explanation of the scope of the dominium proprietatis in question, thus, is important to help drawing ethical principles for any master-slave relationship, especially in what regards good treatment, nourishment, and further restrictions of abuses, excessive work, and unjust punishment by the master. In a nutshell, there are many deeds a master is morally and legally not allowed to do against a slave. After all, the slave has rights qua homo, as a human being. Public authorities are entitled to protect the rights of the slaves in those cases, insofar as they are human beings and our next. And it might be the case that holders would have to compensate them. As a whole, following the judgment by Matthias Kaufmann, Molina seems to be much more committed to the protection of the slave against arbitrary treatment by his master, as it happened in the tradition of Roman law. At any rate, since labor and ownership ethics depends on the justice of slave trade in the first place, it is on the correctness of trade and purchase contract that Molina's exposition focuses. The analysis of the justice of the ownership of slaves in the context of slave trade, and therefore the justice of slave trade itself. These are the focuses. Until the 18th century, this double approach is paradigmatic for most Baroque scholastic texts that morally evaluated black slavery. In particular, the disputes on black slavery by Molina focus first on the moral duty by merchants who were engaged in that multi-linked business chain, that is, who bought slaves from first-hand sellers on the African coast and transported them to the West. And they focus, second, on the moral duty by holders who bought and then possessed slaves in Europe and above all in the New World. Put it simply, any merchant who through purchase or trade became possessor of slaves had the moral duty of checking the validity of any title before buying and offering slaves on the market. And any initially good faith owner, bona fide owner of slaves who came to doubt about their enslavement titles had the moral duty of checking the status of the purchased items and the purchase. To be sure about the justice of the status of enslaved Africans was a moral obligation. Safe conscience by merchants, purchasers, and owners regarding the status is mandatory in the first place. These requirements characterize all normative evaluations we find in texts from Molina onwards. In order to provide a well-informed moral judgment about this buying and selling of enslaved Africans in the first link of the business chain, Molina makes a detailed report of how slave trade on the African coast originally began and was continuously practiced. By so doing, he helped to historically and geographically understand the commerce of slaves from Guinea Superior down to Lower Guinea and Angola, especially in what regards the deals by Portuguese traders with inhabitants of the West African coast. I will have to skip this part of my presentation, although I am aware of the fact that this is important regarding the question whether and to which extent transatlantic slave trade was connected to forms of slavery in West African societies themselves. Molina accepts that merchants buy slaves without any need of further examination from places where the Portuguese had been engaged in wars justly waged. Moreover, in some places, such as in both Guineas, it seemed permissible to buy slaves, that is, people who were sentenced to slavery after all, due to arguably grave felonies according to the local laws. However, Molina was aware that there were many cases in which people were sentenced through spurious processes and because of unacceptable reasons or irrelevant crimes such as stealing objects of minor value. At any rate, Molina thought, in fact, that most likely the entire slave trade was illicit from the beginning. In particular, the merchant as a purchaser had to be certain of the fairness regarding the slave as sold item. It had to be justly enslaved. And regarding the selling, it had to be a just action by a legitimate owner. If justice did not obtain in any of those cases, then the purchaser could not possibly be a legitimate new owner either. He expressed the influential opinion that, although invincible ignorance, and thus the existence of good faith traders, bona fide traders and holders, might be theoretically conceded, regarding the necessary knowledge of the justice of any enslavement, all merchants either knew that the original enslavement and the first selling and purchasing were illegal, or they did not make any relevant effort to verify the justice of the alleged original status of the products. So, for example, everyone knew that those enslaved persons were not put into that condition as a consequence of just wars, according to the jus gentium, but rather quite explicitly just robbed or captured. Since the rumors about the unfairness of the trade were so widespread, the need of previous certification of the status of slavery was an obligation to every merchant. As a consequence, either in one case or the other, traders acted in bad faith. Either they had knowledge that what they did was wrong, or they acted in doubt or vincible ignorance. Under these presuppositions, it must be stressed that Molina, just like others after him, affirmed that merchants and purchasers, having properly confirmed that the status of the product they acquired was illicit or doubtful still, were morally obliged to restitution. In principle, traders had to investigate and be sure of the slavery status before buying slaves. If doubts later arose and through mandatory investigation a trader came to know about the illicitness of enslavement, he was obliged to immediate restitution of freedom. This is valid for any kind of slaveholder, irrespective of his distant position in the chain of trade and ownership, of the time passed since he became an owner, and even of the price he spent with the product. In most cases, restitution would imply the compensation for services rendered and according to the measure of benefit and enrichment by the holders, as well as compensation for bad treatments, offenses, and damages suffered to enslaved people directly or to their heirs, descendants, or relatives. If doubts still later arose, and through investigation an owner was unable to have certainty about the licitness of enslavement, he was obliged to some sort of restitution according to the degree of doubt. Due to the overall widespread doubt regarding the licitness of enslavement and first purchase and ownership, and the moral obligation of verifying the licitness of any slave titles, which were in practice impossible to be proved licit, it is fair to affirm that Molina, the first intellectual in Iberia to treat the problem of black slavery, condemns slave trade, although this is not a stance against slavery. As such, it is not an endorsement of the principle according to which it is always and everywhere wrong that a human being is a property of another human being. It is a stance against the concrete system he was historically evaluating. After 1609, when they were posthumously edited and published, the 6 volumes of Molina's De Justitia et Jure were read in the entire Spanish-Portuguese world, from the Philippines to the Viceroyalty of Peru. On a strictly normative level, Molina condemned transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas. Slave trade went on. Slavery was abolished only 1886 in Cuba, 1888 in Brazil. What happened on the level of ideas? Let's travel now to the New World, to Lima, the Ciudad de los Reyes, the capital of the most successful viceroyalty of the Spanish Empire in the 16th, 18th centuries, that is, the viceroyalty of Peru. Let's imagine the largest college of the Jesuits in Latin America, that is, Colegio Máximo San Pablo, and its most famous principal, Diego de Avendaño. He offered a lengthy exposition on the trade of slaves from Africa to Latin America in the volume 1 of his famous Thesaurus Indicus, a kind of encyclopedia of the Indias. His summary was influential and discussed by other authors. In fact, by surveying Avendaño's main text on the subject, we see that his expositions contains a description of views proposed by major Jesuit authors, as well as his own views, including 7 intriguing reasons for slave trade. As Molina did before him, Diego de Avendaño essentially relates the buying and selling of Ethiopian slaves, African slaves, to the inspection of conscience. He morally analyzes thus the various aspects of a commutatio. Since the buying and owning slaves is a sort of contract, it must be a just contract. Truly, the entire Titulus Avendaño wrote, within which the discussion of slavery appears, was directed to the consulate commerce, that is, an institution in Latin America that should regulate aspects of economic contracts and international trade. He was worried about the morality of contracts involving traders, and the issue regarding black slavery was the inspection of the moral conscience of traders, which depended on the fairness of slavery titles. There is no doubt that by reviewing, for example, positions advanced by Molina, Avendaño in Peru initially endorses and even sharpens Molina's condemnation of transatlantic slave trade. But writing or publishing his work in 1668, that is, about 70 years after Molina's commentaries on De Justitia et Jure, Avendaño also works with a new apparatus of ideas. His theory of normativity is different. It will give us some clues to understand the conventional morality and subtle ideology that was used to justify black slavery. In special, we should initially pay attention to a comment by Avendaño to a reasoning by Molina, according to which slavery should be allowed just in case it was just, in a way, brighter than light itself. Avendaño says something surprising. After all, he both endorsed the principle of safe conscience in allowing slavery, and thus in trading slaves, and affirmed that for reaching such a sound conscience, a just title brighter than light is not necessary, but only a title based on a probable sentence. According to Avendaño, the general opinion that some wars against Africans and Angolans were justly waged, and thus as a consequence, the enslavement of prisoners could be taken indeed by the offended side as a just punishment, was a probable title. Curiously enough, in the passages under analysis, he clearly wants to convince his readers that safe moral reasons are found not necessarily through the principle brighter than light, which would apparently bestow any given reasons for slavery with most safe certainty or evidence, but already through probable reasons. How does this probabilist stance affect Avendaño's position regarding both enslavement and slave trade of Africans? In order to provide an interpretation, It is important to highlight that later in the text, Avendaño brings forth 5 short conclusions, where the first 4 show his clear position of condemning the trade of black slaves, including thesis on freedom, strong thesis on freedom as a human good that does not expire due to bad practices in customary law, and also a most explicit word about the moral obligation of restitution in order to correct the injustice of slavery. But Avendaño's final stance regarding such a theme of applied ethics cannot be reconstructed without taking into consideration the following famous sentence. You can follow me in the slide. The mentioned purchase in the Indies in Europe can be somehow, aliqualiter in Latin, somehow justified. Avendaño describes 7 reasons for his view on the trade of African slaves. 1. There are doctors who do not think that such a trade is openly condemnable, and they are even in favor of such purchases, and here we apparently find Molina et al. 2. Enslavement or slave trade is such a common practice that all states accept it without any hesitations, even bishops and religious men. 3. The Spanish king allows the trade, he buys and sells slaves himself, and it is something blameless that his vassals may follow him as an example of justice. 4. There are bishops who excommunicate people who steal slaves, and by so doing they endorse the correct right of slave owners, as well as purchase and ownership. 5. Many people understand that the African slaves were really born to servitude or to be slaves, to be in the status of slaves. And therefore, regarding them and the justification of their slavery condition, there is not a most exact right as compared to others. In fact, just a minor title. In that case, if nobody or nothing totally inverosimilous is involved, purchasers have nothing to worry about. 6. African slaves are most needed in the Indies, whose conservatio is the interest of the res Christiana. Without slaves, the res publica cannot stand. Besides, those Africans are the vilest among men, so that certain demands of the law of peoples may be set aside. 7. Their transportation to the Indies cannot be impeded, since the kings have urgent reasons to allow and authorize it. The dangerous transportation can only happen if they are properly deprived of their freedom and led into servitude. Moreover, although the blacks are destined to hard work indeed, it does not seem to be the case that they bear it with utmost difficulty. They even perform ritual dances while working, and they do it with clear contentment as long as they are well nourished and holidays are granted them. These are probable reasons in favor of the slave trade of Africans. They are supposed to be probable because they can receive and apparently do receive some rational support by reasonable people. Are they really probable in that sense? How can both sides of Avendaño's report, his condemnation of slavery titles and his support to probable titles that should suffice to justify enslavement and slave trade, be reconciled? I think this is a decisive question to understand the normative problem about black slavery in pre-modern and even in modern times. Some interpreters affirm that such a set of quite contrary views is consistent with Avendaño's moral probabilism. After all, merely probable opinions, even if they are not considered to be more probable or safer opinions, are taken to suffice to meet basic standards of rationality and correctness in order to grant someone, above all, a regular moral agent like a merchant, a good conscience in action. Those opinions should then help agents to minimally see original enslavement titles, trade and ownership of African slaves as probably just titles, though not in a certainty brighter than light itself, as long as a probable practical opinion is internally rational and in accordance with the laws of logic, and thus does not imply any absurdity, as well as externally does not go against natural law, scripture, church fathers, and the explicit dogmatic determinations by the church, and usually does receive some, though not major, external support by others. Authors such as Muñoz Garcia, an important commentator and translator of Avendaño into Spanish, would stress that Avendaño's commitment to probabilism in moral philosophy is a key to interpret his final stance, but his rhetorical strategy should not distract us from the somehow encrypted but obvious conclusion that he was against trade of African slaves. He even says at the end that he wanted to show the injustice of such a business, having fought for the truth and got into a battle for the justice, expecting that the owners shall treat their captives more humanly. Slaveholders should know, moreover, that their right of property is pretty doubtful, to the point that, regarding that matter, to resist the light of truth would be comparable to the situation in which someone walks on daylight with his eyes almost shut. The account of Avendaño, due to its final probabilist accent, is difficult to interpret indeed. His acceptance of probable practical opinion as a case of sufficient ground for achieving right conscience seems to be connected to new aspects of the debate on black slavery. Aspects that arise in the debate between Molina's work around 1600 and Avendaño's volume published in 1668, that is, in the 7 decades of practical doubt regarding the proper ethics applied to the problem of slavery. These aspects will change the very normative assessment of the status, the institution, and the commercial practice of black slavery, connected to moral probabilism as a minimal morality for everyday people. Everyday people usually act according to the opinion of the princes. These very aspects would contribute as a kind of space of possible normativity to make of black slavery a kind of convention, a kind of injustice to unfortunate people whose suppression is beyond our powers. Just like today in countries like mine, in Brazil, we see misery and unjust poverty all the time, but we keep living, accepting a kind of generalized injustice whose immediate suppression is beyond our powers, and that does not radically scandalize our consciences. After all, some of the reasons 5, 6, and 7 by Avendaño indicate that ideologies of quasi-natural slavery and of natural inferiority, at least a natural disposition to labor and subjection, with some ethnic and racial traces, were being taken into consideration. This seems to have as an effect the relativization of the value of freedom for the blacks. In the first half of the 17th century, this narrative is exemplarily conceived by the Jesuit Alonso de Sandoval in his work De Instauranda Aethiopum Salute. I gave you the frontispiece of the second edition, whose background was Sandoval's ministry in Cartagena de Indias, Colombia, and was first published in 1627. In 17th century Portugal and colonial Brazil, a similar narrative in favor of the state of slavery of the blacks would be represented by the master of Christian rhetorics, António Vieira, and so it was in the context of a highly effective way of fixing beliefs of the average moral agent, the sermon. Let me explore Alonso de Sandoval's project and the creation of a probable opinion on slavery. I You should put your attention now to the handout that I gave to you with some passages in Spanish and English. If we have in mind that moral probabilism is a kind of moral relativism, in the sense that there can be several different opinions and arguments that play the role of justifying good conscience, and thus decisions and actions. And if we have in mind that representations of Africa and Africans began to be conceived and fixed as a system of beliefs about human groups and nations, namely blacks and naciones de negros, or ethnicities from Ethiopia or black Africa, the path for the construction of the ideological support of enslavement and transatlantic slave trade will appear clear to us. Here we should know a little bit more about the narrative written by Alonso de Sandoval. By reading Sandoval's De Instauranda a Ethiopium Salute, we can endorse Gwendolyn Hall's general statement that slavery in the Americas was justified by racist ideologies. The same work might be used as an example to confirm Paul Lovejoy's thesis, according to which slavery in the American continent had two distinctive characteristics, namely the manipulation of race as a way to control the captive population and the dimension of an economic rationalization of the system. Alonso de Sandoval's De Instauranda a Ethiopium Salute on the salvation of the blacks, of the Ethiopians to be restored, written in Spanish in spite of the Latin title, would explain the method for restoring the spiritual health to African people. He affirms even more clearly the objective, handout 1 of the book, in words that already indicate racial prejudice based on skin color, in an introductory letter from 1624 to Father Muzio Witelleschi, who happened to be then the general of the Company of Jesus. The book's purpose is to help people who are poor and abandoned. Although they are black, they can be washed clean by the purity and whiteness of Christ's blood. The Instauranda Ethiopium Salute is a treatise on mission and catechetical theology. It is one of the most significant works to understand the several religious, philosophical, cultural presuppositions which, taken together, constitute the ideological mindset for conceiving and historically dealing with the institution of enslaved blacks in colonial Latin America. An important part of that construction was precisely the representation by Sandoval of Ethiopian as a human group or groups, and the characteristics of the language he uses to set up that construction. Race and racism play a role in it, and at the same time, or perhaps even primarily, are constructed and characterized through it. In his book, blacks are all people with black or even dark skin color, which for Sandoval are Ethiopians, and therefore Africans, as well as all inhabitants of India, the Oceania, and the Philippines. In fact, Sandoval's uses of Ethiopian and black cover more or less the same meaning. They cover the feud of tierras and naciones de negros, that is, lands where people with dark skin color live, or recognizable social or political groups of dark-skinned people live. The mission of spiritual salvation of blacks was taken by Sandoval as a special task given to the Company of Jesus. At any rate, the emphasis is on the missionary work among enslaved blacks, that is, those transported to Latin America and living, therefore, in the so-called African diaspora. Since one of the main purposes Sandoval has in his book is to bring some light to his readers in the Western world about the hidden continent that Africa, or the place of the Ethiopians, is, he writes a sort of broad and loose cultural and political history of the Ethiopians indeed. But although he writes many reports and collects much information about Africa, one of the fundaments fundamental characteristics of his many-phase text is the effort of writing, this is important, etiologies. That is, narratives that explain current historical facts, and states, above all, the following two: why Ethiopians are dark-skinned and why they are miserable people that stay at the world's feet. Let's focus on the singular way Sandoval explains the origin of black skin color. He considers two reasons. Black people are so because they were made up of certain intrinsic qualities. Black people are so because of the will of God. If we accept that whiteness and blackness are called by philosophers second qualities of living beings, the idea is that, handout 2, the idea is that these qualities are derived from intrinsic first qualities, such as coldness and extreme heat, to be found in the corresponding matter of the mother. By means of such a quality that God created and planted in a human being, that is, in the character Ham, son of Noah, from the book of Genesis, children were generated having in their appearance black skin color as a true mark of a peculiar descent, as a mark of descent from a cursed human being, thus as a punishment for Ham's having rudely treated his own father, as we read in Genesis 9. So, although blackness as second quality is an effect of extreme heat, handout 3, in the embryonic stuff that is planted in the mother, the latter was ultimately caused by God, as a punishment for Ham's insolent behavior towards his father Noah. By so causing a new intrinsic and hence a new quality in human beings, God himself turned a new aspect of nature into a permanent instrument for punishment of the Ethiopians, the true descendants of Ham. As the Genesis story reports, Ham is taken to have been the first serf and slave in the world, in whom that extreme heat was found and was effective in order to burn all his descendants. And the inhabitants of Ethiopia were Huseos, a word that should derive from Hus, son of Ham, who populated the land. Clearly, the thesis of intrinsic qualities and punishment by God's will are connected. Such connection allows both the understanding of a given naturalness in the slavery of blacks, which Sandoval partially supports, and a supernatural grounding of the condition of blacks. He finds a confirmation of the Genesis etiology of the first servitude in the world in the interpretations by Chrysostom, Ambrose, and Augustine. The fact that Ham's impure lineage was black-skinned is a mark of such punishment and condition of subjection. When slaves were introduced in the world, so were blacks. And the cause of their skin color is a divine punishment for a wrongdoing that deserved an external signal. Handouts 4 and 5. Sandoval reinforces in Book 2 of the Instauranda Ethiopium Salute, Sandoval reinforces in particular ways the representation of Ethiopians as miserable people. Following Aristotle in rhetorics, we are told that there are evils of nature, such as those suffered by human nature for what it is, such as sicknesses, disasters, etc., evils of fate, such as tragedies and misfortunes in life, and evils of the soul, such as bad inclinations and vices. For Aristotle, the description of those evils in discourse should be viewed as reasons for exciting pity towards those who suffer them. Sandoval has the purpose of exciting pity towards blacks in his readers indeed. He emphasizes that evils and sufferings that touch the soul are the central ones. If philosophers show divided opinions about their cause, Sandoval does not hesitate to call it sin. Because of sin, human beings suffer of spiritual vices such as greed, ambition, as well as of the shortcomings of understanding. Sin affects will and intellect, causing them suffering. At any rate, after having made these distinctions, Sandoval affirms that these evils have place among all human beings, but above all, among blacks. He affirms that the fate of Ethiopians is to be slaves. Moreover, God put them in the condition of servitude, and apparently because of the very bad condition of their senses and bodies, they lose half of their understanding and multiply their appetites. Sandoval's position comes close to a sort of natural or factual slavery condition of blacks that is caused by the will of God. In Book 2, Chapter 2, he reminds us of Aristotle, who affirmed that some human beings are naturally born to be slaves and subjects, and we could think that he implies that this condition applies to the blacks, although it would be supernaturally caused by God only after human beings sin. In particular, lack of understanding, congenial incapacity for prudence, and mere corporeal aptness to hard work by the enslaved Africans, again Aristotelian characterizations for slaves by nature, have as an effect more responsibilities for slaveholders. For slaves will need holders who understand what is important for the goodness of their bodies and souls. Sandoval sees the situation as a divine providence for the sake of the blacks and describes slave masters in an Aristotelian sense, where masters possess a complete understanding and the means for supplying the slaves with the other half of understanding they themselves do not have. Beginning with Ham, the first serf and slave passing over his lineage, blacks are depicted as being prone to or inclined by nature to slavery, even if they actually live in civil liberty in Ethiopian lands and nations, and for any given reasons lose it only because of legal grounds as those in the diaspora. Truly, the account of Ethiopians as miserable people, ethnically prone to servitude, still does not explain how and why they went to America through enslavement and slave trade. I just need 6-7 minutes more. I'm really close to finish my presentation. The last two conditions demand a discussion according to the principles of the law of peoples and criteria of commutative justice, also corrective justice. It is a good theoretical question how Alonso de Sandoval combines both accounts: etiological explanation and explanation in terms of the justice of enslavement and of trading slaves. The characterizations of Ethiopians as a cursed human type, cursed non-Christian nations, and miserable people come before the treatment of the just titles of slavery, and with different accents and common language, are overall to find in the book. Although he does not insist on the point, he is conscious that due to such testimonies by many people, slave trade is not free of injustices to the Africans, together with what the doctores say on the matter. Christians, generally speaking, should make use of quiet reflection in order to judge about the justice of enslavement, that is, in cases where those doubts arise. But as a general point, Sandoval believes freedom is an original human condition. In the beginning, people were not put into the world by God as masters and slaves. People began to tyrannize others by taking away their liberty because of malice. Human being is naturally, or according to nature before the advent of sin, free, and any human being is made slave because of iniquity. Malice explains why this does not happen in practice. And here, by touching an Augustinian leitmotif for explaining the introduction of slavery into the world, that is sin, Sandoval endorses the idea that it can be both caused by the iniquity of unjust enslavers and because of sins committed by persons that were then, as a consequence, justly enslaved. In fact, liberty now is not equally shared, but, and this seems to be the most important thing for our Jesuit, The gospel is equally destined to all human beings as most excellent creatures of God, and even though there can be masters and slaves, they are equally called to the salvation of their souls through the deeds of Christ. It is at this level that there is the same freedom for all, a freedom through faith of the servitude of sin, which gives someone highest nobility and the dignity of equally being servants of Christ. At the end, in an eschatological sense, everyone will receive a prize only because of their good and or evil deeds on the spiritual level. People thus should most care about the healing of their souls, which are in need of being redeemed by Christ. Handout 6. The final sentence of Sandoval concerning the problem of trade's safe conscience confirms that he was at the same time aware of many situations of unjust enslavements and unable to confront the system of slave trade at a legal, economic, and political level. After all, Sandoval relieves the situations of doubt, for he accepts the idea, quoting, blacks were captured with the justice that God knows. And under the status of corporeal slavery, they happen to be touched by the hands of the Jesuits, who should bring them relief, seeking their spiritual freedom, and above all, the freedom of their souls. Surely the Jesuits would work concretely also for the slaves' bodily relief as soon as they arrive at South American ports after horrendous conditions of shipment, as a means to the much more important end of catechesis, doctrine, baptism, and confession. They would also make all possible efforts to introduce in the establishment of slavery in the New World a kind of New Testamentary, also inspired in Augustine, master and slave ethics of paternalistic tutelage by Western white masters and of organic and symbiotic mutual help and benefit. Slaves provide labor force and serve their owners and tutors. Masters, both lay and clergymen, provide good treatment and Christian education and offer true religion. In a family with such a structure, true believers and redeemed people live under the same spiritual freedom and, in a sense, the same spiritual servitude towards each other in love and subjection to Christ as Lord. This can even be described as a singular form of friendship between Christian master and Christian slaves, handouts 7 and 8. And it can be described as the social political ideal that enslaved blacks could expect for this life. Up to a certain point, they would be on the same status because of which whites are important, being Christians. They would then be respected, and they would be able to go to the temples and houses of God to associate and eat with the other Christians. If they are Christians, when they die, they will be buried in the church. This is the final reason why the justice of the slavery status by blacks would be a probable opinion. By examining the combination of the etiology of their skin color and racial condition, the doubts about enslavement and trade, the falsity of the religions they professed in Africa, the horrible conditions of life in the continent they left behind, and everything they would receive in the Spanish Christian ethos in the New World, there could be no doubt that the enslavement and transportation to the Americas was a good thing for the blacks, a kind of good captivity. Handout 9 and 10, very important. In the new land, they would receive the holy water of baptism, the liberty of the soul. They would live as slaves in a good house, treated well by a new family. I'm quoting now, okay? But I have actually to say that recently important people in Brazil have defended or are defending similar points of view about the meaning of black slavery to the descendants of enslaved Africans. I'm quoting Sandoval. Make them understand that the Lord did them great mercy in bringing them to a Christian land. It is better to be a slave here than free in their lands. Because here, even though the body suffers working in captivity, the soul rests in the liberty that is attained through the holy water of baptism. Tell them that in this land they have family. If they serve well, they will have, this is the expression, a good captivity. And they will be content and well dressed. Tell them to give up their sadness and pain and be happy. Through baptism and the cleaning up of their souls, followed by the obedience to God's commands, enslaved Africans will obtain not now, but in the afterlife, a condition in which now, as free men, the whites are already in, a life in free Christian brotherhood. Clearly, Sandoval's reports, my concluding words, both review and construct or confirm a representation of the different Ethiopians that appeals to patterns of prejudice and discrimination. I told you, there was no racial and ethnic discourse in 1600 in Molina's work. The narrative selected by me, both in content and in language, construct blacks as a human type to be found in many different human groups and nations, thus ethnicities, both full of congenial defective aspects and marked by an inferior condition, servitude or natural inclination to servitude. Moreover, black or Ethiopian as a human type is characterized by aspects that, at the end, are confirmed or even caused by God. Moreover, any possible positive attitude concerning the conditions in which Ethiopians or enslaved blacks are transported to the Americas is relativized by the fact that Africans are not Christians and are in desperate need of salvation. The good of the salvation of the soul relativizes the urgency of providing any other human good that would be otherwise due to the blacks and denied to them along the projects of colonization. Sandoval seems to view, thus, in black slavery, more benefits than flaws. His major work confirms the social institution of slavery in the Spanish and Catholic projects in the Americas, one imperial project of colonization and one project of ecclesiastical imperialism. A presupposition of the entire work is that, in fact, miserable people like the dark-skinned enslaved Africans have actually just a minor title, a minor right, as Avendaño mentioned. I have given one example of how moral probabilism could operate on the level of ideas to relativize ways of getting sound moral conscience regarding the problems of enslavement and trade. The association of that plural morality with allegedly probable opinions about the diminished right of the blacks and advantages of slavery for them and for everyone helped creating a kind of naturalization of the state of enslavement by blacks and many ideological mechanisms to adapt their use as labor force to an Iberian American Christian ethos, where both an offer of paternalistic care, a master-slave ethics, and religious truth, Catholic Christianity, might be found. It was part of that convention and space of normativity, the view that Ethiopians are miserable people, and the institution of slavery was quite acceptable regarding them. I hope you realize that I'm trying to understand ideologies, the ideology of black slavery from the inside. And of course, I'm not giving any report of my opinion and any support to these opinions. Thank you so much for your attention.